Roger Federer is the greatest tennis player in history by most accounts, and yet his victory at the Australian Open 2017, which was his 18th Grand Slam title win, was by pretty much any standard miraculous in its nature. I mean, this is a win that probably should not have happened or even have been possible. I mean, there's been tournaments in the past where he's played amazingly at Grand Slam finals and semi-finals, but not gone on to win the tournament. I mean, a great example for me would be the French Open 2011 final versus Nadal. I thought he really outplayed Nadal many times in the first three sets. Yet he actually lost that final in four sets and Nadal took the title. But this was the other scenario. This was where a lot of the different ways the tournament played out and a lot of the ways he won were not normal, were not him at what had been the best of his career when he was the best player by far, etc. And yet, despite all of that, he was able to win the title. So first and foremost, the reason why he shouldn't have been able to win this title is that the man is 35 years old. Now, in tennis terms, that's way too old. For anyone who doesn't know this, I actually went and looked up the stats for this. Oldest people to win Grand Slams. Now, yes, there's this guy called Ken Rosewell, who was winning Grand Slams between age 33 and 37. But that was in the late 60s, the early 70s. Yes, Arthur Ashe, Rod Laver, these guys have won Grand Slams above 30. But again, we're talking about 60s, 70s. We're not talking about the modern era. In the modern era, the only real name you see who's vaguely close is Andre Agassi, who won his last one at age 32. But you have to understand, he had a middle part of his career where he was banned for drug use, and he had the period where his career went down the shits, and then he had to get it together playing with that guy like Jill, whatever his name was, who was a friend of his, and then obviously get Brad Gilbert to help retool his game. So he really had sort of a middle part where he wasn't as active, and then he retooled his whole game and had that revival late on. Plus, even then, he was really breaking down physically towards the end. It's just that his mental game had completely been fixed. And a key detail, he really played during the early 2000s when he won a lot of his latter Grand Slams on the back half of his career in an era of mad parity. It was a passing of the guard sort of era of the great players dying away. People like Sampras, he won his last one at 31. Connors won at 31, like a decade and a half before. But this was a period when there was a lot of different people winning the French Open. There was a lot of parity at that point in time. Now, people will say, right, well, Federer's won this when he's this old because, well, modern technology, ability to recover, the technology of the rackets, people being able to be more fit, have better physio, have better recovery time. But that's not really it, actually. Like, first and foremost, he probably has the only style of any of the old great players that would actually even allow him at this point in his career to win a Grand Slam. If anything, the current greats, you people like Nadal, Djokovic, Murray, if you look at their style of play, it's way less likely they're going to last above the age of sort of 31, 32 and have any chance to win Grand Slams. Their style of play is too physical, they extend points too long, they try to grind too much, the surfaces are slower in general. I mean, that's an interesting detail. The Australian Open seemed a bit quicker this time around. Also, add in, another reason why he probably shouldn't have won this title on the surface of the narrative, the last Grand Slam he won was about 5 years ago, and then before that you have to go back 7 years to find the second to last one that he won. So this is a guy who hadn't even been winning in the last few years. It's not like he was in fantastic form and then the others dropped out and then he just took the natural course and won the title as you'd expect. He's been struggling to win Grand Slams despite great runs to semis and finals, etc., admittedly often being stopped by the great players of the era. But not always. I mean, there was that US Open, remember? Was it 2014? The one where he lost to Cilic in the semi-finals and would have played Nishikori in the finals. So that looked like on paper it was a free Grand Slam once Djokovic lost the other semi, but he got stopped in the semis by amazing serving by Cilic. So then you got to add in that he did win the final over Nadal. Now, remember, Nadal is his great rival. Nadal famously was the kryptonite, the counter to his style because of having that left-handed, double-hand style of hitting back and constantly just looping the ball into Federer's backhand. In theory, the weakest shot, still a good shot, but the weakest shot in Federer's game, extending points, making Federer go for crazy winners. He would miss too many of them. He'd have unforced errors. Also, his serving over the middle part. At the end of the 2000s, basically the middle part of their rivalry, Federer's clutch serving sort of went to shit a little bit against Nadal because Nadal was just so good at returning, actually. It seemed to rattle Federer a little bit and, again, make him take more risks. So you would have thought if he was going to win it, it's not going to be over someone like Nadal, even though admittedly Nadal is older and he's really decayed much more than Federer has. And you see what I mean about how those really physical players don't last as long. So, interestingly enough, a detail about his win here is that sneakily, over the years, the Australian Open has actually kind of deceptively turned into Roger Federer's best slam. I mean, on paper, you'd say, right, Wimbledon, obviously his best slam. He's won the 7 titles. He's been in so many finals. He's been incredible there. Certainly incredible on grass. US Open at one point in time, people would have said, oh, that's his second best surface. You know, he won the 5 titles in a row. He was in the semis like every single year for 7-8 years. But you know what? You look at it now, Federer has been in the semi-finals or better of every Australian Open rather, for the last 14 years, except 2015, the one where he went out in the 3rd round. That's the only one that he didn't make it super far. Every other one, he's minimum making it to the semi-finals. That's how good this guy's been at that one slam. And now, obviously, he's won 5 of them. Crucially, you go back over the years, even his losses at the Australian Open are incredibly close. Earlier in his career, when he was in absolute God mode, you know, you'd have to beat him in 5 sets in incredible play. Then you go to later on, even again, these are really close matches. Nadal, when he loses in 2012, Australian Open final 2009, obviously incredibly close game. There's even, I mean, he had one against Djokovic. What was that, 2012, I think, in the semis? That was even still pretty close. A couple of sets that were like overtimes. Very, very close. The only ones you look at that weren't particularly close affairs would probably be like Nadal in 2014. He kind of got schooled a bit. And Djokovic last year, he's sure he won a set, but otherwise Djokovic really toyed with him. And at that point in time, Djokovic was just winning so much in their rivalry. So you go back. Another thing that adds to how great he's been at the Australian Open is 2 of his losses at the Australian Open. So the Australian Open 2009 final against Rafa Nadal, and then the semi-final in 2012. They're just 2 of the best matches you'll ever see played. He played incredibly high level, even though he lost both these matches. Go watch them if you've never seen them. They'll be on YouTube somewhere. So the way this win was able to come about, first and foremost, Murray and Djokovic. I mean, I realise Djokovic is in a slump at the moment, but in theory, the 2 best players of this current era both had to go out early. That probably did have to happen. Like, when you consider the 5 setters that Federer was getting into later on in the tournament, it seems hard to believe if he'd have played Murray and Nadal, I mean, he'd played Murray in the quarterfinals, and Djokovic rather, that he'd have really been beating these guys in possibly extended series. Like, if they just have, they've got the game to beat him right now as an old man. Also, add that in, by the way, again, Federer's not really a player in this part of his career who wins those big 5-set series. He won 3 of them in this particular tournament, which is crazy shit. Go back in history and look at how he usually does. He either usually wins in 3 or 4 sets, or he gets beaten in 5 sets. That's the way it is with Federer for the last like 10, 12 years at this point in time. So, first and foremost, he needed the big seeds to get out of the way. Then you got to add in, I mean, not just because if you look at the way this tournament, even with as well as he played in this tournament, how close some of those 5-setters are, I think Murray would have beaten him. I think Djokovic has had the mental edge over him for a while now and knows how to frustrate him and neutralise him to some degree. Certainly would be interesting to see this backhand against Djokovic now, but we haven't been able to yet, obviously. Then, early on, he had a challenge in Berdych. Berdych is still no joke. I realise he never got to the heights of winning the Grand Slam, etc. But on paper, Berdych is still, I mean, he's still just within the range where he should be dangerous, should at least push someone like Federer. Federer was able to get past Berdych with ease. He toyed with this guy. And actually, I have to say, that is something that's not unusual. Because actually, over the last 5 or so years, ever since finally Berdych upset him at that Wimbledon, it feels like actually Federer's really zoned in and he's figured out how to beat Berdych consistently in big games. Then he goes into that slugfest with Nishikori, which was ridiculous. I mean, Nishikori's a guy who can go head-to-head with Djokovic in those sorts of dogfights and sometimes win. So the idea that Federer was able to go constantly back and forwards with him, such a young guy as well, coming into his prime, and then beat him, that was insane shit. Nishikori's no joke. We'll see in the next few years if he can win any slams. Then you got to add in, he plays against Wawrinka, right, in the semi-final. The just sheer mental resilience to be able to still win against Wawrinka. He says he was felt kind of lucky. Yeah, I can see why. His game had totally broken down. Wawrinka was right back in that match. Really looked, I mean, admittedly, both of them had injury issues. But Wawrinka has a godlike backhand. Incredibly hard to play against. He's a guy who, I actually think the key thing is, you've noticed Federer has still beaten Wawrinka the last couple of years. And that's because I think Wawrinka has a mental disadvantage for some weird reason against Federer. And somehow he tends to just wilt when it's the really clutch point. If you can kind of take his soul a little bit, he doesn't do the same insane shit that he does against Nadal or Djokovic, Wawrinka we're talking about here, against Federer as often. It seems like he wilts a little bit and he's always on the brink and Federer can sometimes pushing over with kind of veteran savvy. Then he goes against, I mean, I can't remember even how you say this guy's name, Zverev. who is the guy who had beaten Murray, and he just cleaned house with this guy. He just absolutely wrecked this guy. There was some close points, but overall, Federer in control the whole way. I think that guy had a bit of nerves get to him, unfortunately. But then you get to the final. I did that in the wrong order there. You get to the final where he plays Rafa. Now, first of all, I already mentioned before, he'd been losing to Rafa for the last 10 years in Grand Slams. Rafa has the kryptonite to him. Yes, Rafa's older, but he still has the style. We even saw that 3 years ago where Rafa beat him in the semis of the Australian Open. But this is the best thing. He beats Rafa by giving Rafa a taste of his own medicine. What Rafa would always do from about 2008 to, well, I mean, now almost, basically until this slam, is whenever he played Federer, Federer would have to hit amazing game winners, amazing aces. That's how he'd get ahead. If Nadal could return the ball and just keep points extended and keep himself there, then he'd creep into Federer's service games and he'd get it to like 30, 40, he'd get it to some deuce games, and then just by putting himself in position again and again and again, he'd be able to break Federer at key points in the match. Meanwhile, famously, for the last like 7-8 years, whenever Federer got Nadal to break points, he used to be so bad at converting them for some reason. I mean, his serve would just evaporate completely, and he'd have games where he got like 3 break points. Well, I mean, 3 is probably too many. Let's say like 2 break points out of like 15 attempts or something crazy, while Nadal would have an incredible conversion ratio. Well, this time around, Federer gave Rafa a taste of his own medicine. He was the one who kept in Rafa's games all the time, who kept going at him constantly, who kept bringing it back to deuce and kept putting the pressure on him. And as a result, was able to then get over the hump, as it were, with his own mental edge, which is what had always broken him in the past, mentally and in terms of literally his service games. And then what was the tool that he was allowed to beat Rafa with? Perfect. If you're going to write the story, an incredible single-handed backhand. Because this whole event, his backhand looked better than it has ever looked against this level of competition. Federer's backhand looked like the best backhand in the entire tournament. And that was a tournament featuring Wawrinka. So this was incredible shit. We've never seen this from him in the past. He always had a good backhand. People overestimated that it wasn't that good because Nadal was purposely picking on it and had the style to be able to beat it. Plus, if you tried it off just a good shot to hit a really hard game winner, Nadal can return some of those, and it's going to be real tough to get them in. So I always felt like in the Nadal rivalry in the past, this was the sticking point. Because of that style where Nadal with the left hand would hit to Federer's backhand constantly over and over again. And people said, Federer's just too stubborn. He should run around it more, which he tried to sometimes. And he was quite stubborn. He thought he could still do it. Now, the problem is, in those past years, I always thought the cracks always appeared for Federer when he tried to, off his backhand, hit insane game winners. I mean, think of those matches I was talking about before. Australian Open 2009 final. French Open 2011 final. Australian Open 2012 semi-final. Go watch these games. They're amazing games. Because when Federer does hit, he hits on real shots that are like absolute outplays. But he's trying to just constantly go right for the corner, paint the lines with his backhand. His backhand wasn't quite as good at the time. And obviously he had a different racket and a different coach at the time. So that was always what would not quite work enough to let him be able to win the match. And Nadal could stick around and just edge him out every time. In general, I've always thought in his rivalry, from 2008 onwards, when Rafa was really beating him quite consistently, I've always thought that was actually one of the key problems Federer had, is that because he knew he couldn't get into extended points, and because he knew Nadal's only going to keep hitting it back, so it's going to be a tough shot every time, he would just always go for these insane winners. And he would think he could do it, but then no one can just hit godlike winners 24/7. I mean, we know Wawrinka's done it a couple of times to win against these monsters, but even he can't do it that often. That's why he isn't like a guy who's consistently making the finals of Grand Slams. So what was amazing was this tournament, at age 35, Federer's backhand looked Wawrinka-esque. It was ridiculous how straight he could hit it when he had the guy moved out of position. And so the idea you could add this monster weapon to your game at age 35 is absolutely ridiculous. So, I mean, the whole thing to me was miraculous. Even though he's the greatest player ever, this was not, in theory, something that should have been able to happen.